The train groaned into Silver Creek like a dying beast, bleeding steam into an air so cold it felt solid. For 3 days, that groan had been the rhythm of Ella Lanina Morgan's life, a constant, shuddering promise of a future she had folded and refolded in her mind like the stiff pages of William Prescott's letters. Now, as the carriage door slid open, the promise met the reality of a biting wind that smelled of pine and coal smoke. She had to duck her head to exit, a motion so ingrained in her life that she no longer thought of it as a concession. Ella was a tall woman, not gracefully so, not in the way of willows or aspens that poets wrote about back in Boston. She was built of sterner stuff, with the long bones and broad shoulders of her Swedish forebears, a fact that had made her an object of quiet pity in the cramped parlors of the East. In Silver Creek, she had hoped things would be different. Here, where the mountains scraped the sky, surely a woman's stature would be measured by her grit, not her inches. Stepping down onto the wooden platform, her boots made a solid, definitive sound against the boards. She clutched her single, heavy valise, its leather worn smooth from the long journey. Her gray wool coat, practical and thick, was her only armor against the cold and the curious eyes that now settled upon her. The whole of Silver Creek, it seemed, had turned out to witness the arrival of the afternoon train. Men in thick coats and worn hats, their face chapped by the wind. Women with shawls pulled tight, their expressions a mixture of boredom and keen appraisal. Children, momentarily silenced, pointed with mittened hands. Ella scanned the faces, her heart a nervous bird against her ribs. She was looking for the man whose words had been her beacon for 6 months. Mr. William Prescott, proprietor of the town's mercantile, a widower seeking a sensible and sturdy companion to build a life with. His letters were not filled with poetry, but with practicalities that felt more honest. He wrote of long winters and the need for a well-stocked larder, of the town's growth, of his desire for a partner to share the quiet burden of respectability. He had praised her own letters for their clarity of mind and lack of feminine hysterics. In his carefully formed script, she had read the promise of acceptance. He knew she was not a petite flower. She had described herself as of a notable height and plain-featured. Believing honesty was the only foundation for such a long-distance arrangement. He had written back that substance is of greater value than ornament in this country. And there he was. She knew him instantly from the small, formal photograph he had sent. A compact man, shorter than she had imagined, with a neatly trimmed mustache and a waistcoat that strained slightly at the buttons. He stood apart from the others, a man conscious of his station, holding a beaver fur hat in his hands. Their eyes met across the 20 feet of platform. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a slight, almost imperceptible smile. Relief washed over Ella, so potent it nearly buckled her knees. He saw her. He was here. The gamble had paid off. She offered a small, hesitant smile in return, and took a step forward, the valise suddenly feeling lighter. He took a step to meet her, his smile widening. Then he stopped. It was not a sudden halt. It was a slow freezing, a stiffening of his entire posture as his eyes, which had been fixed on her face, traveled downward. They took in the breadth of her shoulders under the wool coat, followed the long line of her frame, and seemed to measure her against the door of the station house behind her. The smile didn't just fade. It was wiped away, replaced by a look of profound, almost comical disbelief. Then, something harder settled in its place: displeasure, a deep, wounding offense, as if she had deliberately tried to deceive him. He took a half-step back. It was a small movement, but on the crowded platform, it felt like a chasm opening between them. The murmuring of the crowd, which had been a low hum, began to die down. People sensed a drama unfolding. They turned their full attention to the tall woman in the gray coat and the small, indignant man, who now looked at her as if she were a misdelivered piece of freight. Mr. Prescott. Ella's voice was lower than she intended, a husk of sound in the frigid air. The name felt foreign on her tongue now, brittle and unsafe. He did not answer her directly. His gaze flickered away from her, sweeping over the watching faces of his neighbors, and a dark flush crept up his neck. He was a man of standing in this town. He was being made a fool of. He cleared his throat, a sharp, angry sound. "There has been a mistake," he announced, his voice tight and loud enough for everyone to hear. He was no longer speaking to her, but to the town. He was correcting a public error, absolving himself of this colossal absurdity. Ella stood frozen, the valise handle digging into her palm. The cold she had felt moments before was nothing to the ice flooding her veins now. This was not happening. It was a nightmare born of travel fatigue. In a moment, he would laugh, apologize for his momentary shock, and lead her away from these staring eyes. But he did not laugh. He turned fully to the station master, a lanky man who was watching the scene with a practiced neutrality. "Station master," Prescott said, his tone clipped and businesslike. "This woman, she has arrived in error. She will be returning on the morning train." The word hung in the air, *woman*. Not Miss Morgan, not my correspondent. Just an anonymous, inconvenient object. He reached into his waistcoat, his movements jerky and precise. He pulled out a small leather coin purse, opened it, and extracted several coins, dropping them with a sharp clink onto the station master's ticket counter. That should cover her passage back to wherever she came from. He declared. He did not look at Ella again. Not once. He placed his hat firmly on his head, tugged at the bottom of his waistcoat as if to straighten his dignity, and turned his back on her. He walked away, disappearing into the crowd that parted for him like water around a stone. For a long moment, there was only the hiss of the train and the sharp intake of a dozen breaths. Then, the whispers began. They started as a low rustle and grew into a wave of snickers and unconcealed murmurs. A woman hid a laugh behind her gloved hand. A group of loggers standing near the baggage cart openly guffawed. They looked her up and down, their gazes insolent and mocking. She was the punchline to a joke she hadn't even been told. Ella did not move. She did not cry. She did not lower her head. A lifetime of being looked at, of being measured and found wanting, had taught her this one thing: how to stand still, how to build a wall inside herself, brick by silent brick, until the noise from the outside could not get in. She fixed her gaze on a knot in the gray, weathered wood of the station wall. She focused on its whorls and imperfections, making it the anchor of her world. If she looked at the knot, she would not have to see the smirking faces. If she concentrated on the cold air entering her lungs, she would not have to hear the word they were whispering, *giantess*. Her coat felt immensely heavy. The journey had settled into its fibers, a collection of coal dust, stale air, and shattered hopes. She had arrived in Silver Creek less than 5 minutes ago, and she had already been tried, judged, and sentenced in the court of public opinion. William Prescott, with his tidy mustache and his empty promises of substance over ornament, had been her judge and jury. The station master cleared his throat, a sound of mild embarrassment. "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "the train for the east departs at dawn. There's a boarding house, Martha's place, just down the street. She has clean rooms." Ella finally tore her gaze from the knot in the wood. She looked at the station master, her eyes clear and dry. She gave a single, stiff nod. She could not trust her voice. She bent down, her back straight, and picked up her valise. The weight of it was familiar, a solid, grounding thing in a world that had just dissolved beneath her feet. She did not look at the crowd as she walked off the platform. She kept her chin level, her gaze fixed on the muddy, snow-dusted street ahead. She could feel their eyes on her back, a physical pressure. Every step was an act of will. She had not yet taken off her coat, had not yet felt the warmth of a fire or the comfort of a meal. She had not even had a chance to breathe the air of her new life before it was snatched away. But as she walked toward the boarding house, one foot in front of the other, she was not retreating. She was bracing. The first blow had landed, and she was still standing. The street was a river of mud and melting snow, a treacherous path between two rows of false-fronted buildings that seemed to lean in, whispering. Ella felt the town's gaze like a physical weight on her shoulders, a silent mockery that followed her from the station. She did not hurry. To rush would be to admit defeat, to show them they had broken her. So she walked with a measured, deliberate pace, her back as straight as a mast, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the end of the world. Each splash of icy water that seeped through the seams of her boots was a small, private misery, a detail in a much larger humiliation. She was a landmark, an unfortunate spectacle. In Boston, she had learned to navigate the world by making herself smaller, by stooping, by choosing muted colors, by speaking in a low voice. It was a constant, exhausting performance of apology for the space she occupied. Here, on this open, unforgiving street, there was nowhere to hide. She was what she was, a woman built on a scale that this town, and its leading citizen, found offensive. The shame of it was a hot, metallic taste in her mouth, a stark contrast to the freezing air she drew into her lungs. The station master had pointed vaguely, "Down the street," but the street stretched on, a morass of ruts and hoofprints. Every window she passed seemed to contain a pale, watching face. The laughter from the platform had subsided, but its echo remained, replaced by a more insidious, dissecting silence. They were taking her measure, committing her unfortunate dimensions to memory. She would be a story told over dinner tables tonight, a cautionary tale for mail-order brides, the woman who was too much woman for William Prescott. Her focus narrowed to the simple act of placing one foot in front of the other. She was an automaton of dignity, powered by sheer will. It was then, as she passed the narrow alley between the blacksmith's and the assayer's office, that she felt a change in the air. A scent, clean and sharp, cut through the town's miasma of wood smoke and manure. It was the smell of pine resin and cold stone, the scent of the deep woods that bordered the town like a dark, silent ocean. A man emerged from the edge of the town, where the last of the buildings gave way to the first of the great pines. He hadn't been part of the crowd at the station. He moved with a long, easy stride that ate up the muddy ground without effort, as if the earth were more familiar to him than any wooden sidewalk. He carried a double-bitted axe over one shoulder, its head gleaming with use, its handle worn dark and smooth. He was tall, taller even than her, with a breadth to his shoulders that spoke of a life spent wrestling with timber and gravity. He was walking toward the center of town, on a path that would intersect with hers. Ella's first instinct was to flinch, to brace for another look of ridicule or surprise. She angled her body slightly, preparing to pass him with as much distance as the narrow street would allow. But he did not alter his course to avoid her, nor did he slow to gawk. He simply kept walking, his gaze steady under the brim of a plain, felt hat. As they drew level, he stopped, not abruptly, but with a natural pause, like a river current meeting a stone. He stood directly in front of her, blocking her path. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low baritone, a sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. It held no mockery, no surprise. It was a simple acknowledgement of her presence. Ella stopped, her hand tightening on the handle of her valise. She lifted her chin and met his eyes. They were a clear, startling gray, the color of a winter sky before a snow. And for the first time since stepping off that train, she looked at a man eye to eye. She did not have to look down. He did not have to look up. They were two tall figures standing in a muddy street, the cold air swirling around them. His gaze was direct. It was not the invasive, appraising stare of the other townsmen. He saw her height. She could see the simple recognition of fact in his eyes, but it was not the sum of her. His gaze moved from her tall frame to her face, and it rested there with a quiet intensity, as if he were looking for something beyond the surface. He was not looking at a spectacle. He was looking at a person. "You're looking for Martha's place," he stated. It wasn't a question. Ella was momentarily stunned into silence by the sheer ordinariness of the remark. He spoke as if they were two travelers meeting on a road, as if the whole town wasn't holding its breath, watching them. "Yes," she managed to say. The word came out as a white plume of vapor, mingling with his own in the space between them. He gave a slight nod, his eyes still on hers. "It's the last house on the left, the one with the blue door. Can't miss it." He could have walked on then. He had answered the question she hadn't asked, but he remained, a solid presence against the backdrop of the hostile town. The scent of the forest clung to him, a clean, wild smell that was a world away from William Prescott's starched collars and pomade. "Martha," he continued, his voice still low and even. "She sometimes takes on help, mending for the loggers at my camp, mostly. The work is hard on clothes." Ella stared at him. The words hung in the air. Simple, practical, and utterly revolutionary. Asterisk help, mending, work. These were words that implied a future, a reason to stay. They were the opposite of a one-way ticket back east. He was offering her a possibility, a slim crack of light in a day that had gone completely dark. It was not an offer of pity. His tone was too matter-of-fact for that. It was information, given freely and without expectation. A tool, laid at her feet for her to either pick up or ignore. A profound and unfamiliar sensation bloomed in Ella's chest. For her entire life, her height had been a problem to be managed, a feature that made others uncomfortable and, in turn, made her feel clumsy, oversized, and apologetic. She had always felt herself looming, a shadow falling over smaller people, but standing here, before this stranger, the feeling was gone. His own stature created a different kind of space around them. In his presence, she was not an anomaly. She was simply present, proportional. For the first time, she did not feel small for being so large. She just felt like herself. "My camp is north of here," he added, as if an afterthought. "Blackwood Timber." Gabriel Blackwood. The name suited him. It sounded like the deep woods he came from, like something strong and rooted. "Thank you," Ella said, and this time, her voice was steady. The two words felt inadequate to convey the magnitude of the lifeline he had just thrown her, but they were all she had. He gave another small, single nod. It was a gesture of completion. He had said what he meant to say. He shifted the axe on his shoulder, the movement fluid and powerful. And then he stepped aside, clearing her path. He continued his walk toward the center of town, his boots making solid, unhurried tracks in the mud. He didn't look back. Ella stood for a moment after he had passed, watching his retreating form. The town was still there. The watching eyes were still in the windows, but they seemed farther away now. Their power diminished. The air where he had stood still held the ghost of pine and cold, clean air. She looked down the street toward the last house on the left. She saw a flicker of blue. Then she looked back in the direction of the train station, where the promise of a safe, humiliating retreat awaited her at dawn. She took a deep breath, the icy air a shock to her system, clearing the last vestiges of fog and despair. She held the breath for a second, then let it out in a long, visible cloud. She was still a stranger here, and the town's verdict on her was already in. But one man had spoken to her as if she were a human being. One man had offered a foothold, no matter how precarious. Clutching her valise, Ella Lenina Morgan turned her back on the station and began to walk toward the house with the blue door. Martha, the proprietor of the boarding house, was a woman carved from the same tough timber as the town itself. She was wide, weathered, and had eyes that missed nothing. When Ella stood on her doorstep, valise in hand. Martha had simply looked her up and down, her gaze lingering for a moment on Ella's face. Not her frame. She noted the exhaustion, the carefully banked humiliation, and the core of iron resolve beneath it. "Heard what happened at the station," Martha said, her voice as rough as burlap. It wasn't a question or an invitation for complaint. It was a statement of fact. "Prescott's a fool who values the shine on his shoes more than the soul of a person. Room's in the back, $5 a week, meals included. You'll help with the laundry to start." She didn't offer pity, and for that, Ella was profoundly grateful. Pity was a soft, suffocating thing. Practicality was a foundation she could build on. The room was small, tucked away at the back of the house, with a single window that looked out onto a patch of muddy ground and the looming wall of the forest beyond. It contained a narrow bed with a patchwork quilt, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a single straight-backed chair. It was a cell, but it was also a sanctuary. Here, she could close the door on the whispering town. For the first 2 days, Ella did as she was told. She scrubbed sheets in a steaming tub until her hands were raw, the harsh lye soap a welcome, purifying sting. She folded linens, the crisp scent of them a small comfort. She worked alongside Martha in a rhythm of shared, unspoken understanding. But in the evenings, when the other boarders, a handful of miners, and a traveling land surveyor ate their supper with furtive glances in her direction, Ella would retreat to her room. There, she unpacked the tools of her trade. They were not grand. A heavy pair of steel shears, a collection of needles wrapped in felt, thimbles of silver and brass worn thin with use, and dozens of spools of thread cotton, silk, and sturdy linen, organized by color in a partitioned wooden box. These were her inheritance, passed down from a mother who had taught her that a straight seam and a steady hand were more valuable than a pretty face. She began by mending her own travel-worn dress, reinforcing the placket and restitching a frayed cuff with tiny, invisible stitches. Then, she mended one of Martha's aprons, which had a tear near the pocket. She didn't just patch it. She worked a simple, elegant piece of embroidery over the repair, a small spray of pine needles, their green thread a stark, beautiful contrast to the faded cotton. She left it, folded neatly, on the kitchen table. The next morning, Martha was wearing it. The woman said nothing, but as she handed Ella a cup of coffee, her rough fingers brushed against Ella's in a gesture that felt like an endorsement. A few days later, Martha cleared out a small, unused pantry adjacent to the kitchen. "The light is better here," she said gruffly. "No sense in you ruining your eyes in that back room." And so, the pantry became Ella's workshop. She set her sewing box on a small table, hung her shears from a nail, and began. She put a small, hand-lettered sign in the boarding house window, "Mending and seamstress work. Inquire within." The town did not rush to her door, but slowly, things trickled in. A miner with a pair of canvas trousers torn at the knee, a farmer's wife who needed a christening gown taken in for a new baby. The work was small, but Ella treated each piece as a testament. Her stitches were even and strong. Her patches lay flat. Her darns were woven so skillfully they were nearly invisible. She did not just fix the damage, she fortified the garment against future wear. The precision of her work was a silent argument against the town's hasty judgment of her. She was not a clumsy, oversized mistake. She was a craftswoman of exceptional skill. She did not bow her head. When townsfolk came to the door, she would rise to her full height and look them in the eye, discussing the work with a quiet professionalism that left no room for personal comments. They would leave their garments and their money, their curiosity only partially satisfied. The whispers continued. They said Prescott had a lucky escape. They wondered aloud what sort of man would want a woman who could look down on him. But the whispers were now tinged with a grudging respect for her needle. The work, at least, was good. Martha became her shield. One afternoon, a woman named Beatrice Miller, a friend of William Prescott's late wife, came by on the pretense of having a shawl refringed. "It's a wonder you stayed, Miss Morgan," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "After such a public misunderstanding, most women would have been on the next train." Before Ella could reply, Martha emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her embroidered apron. "Most women aren't made of sand and steel," Martha said, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Miller. "Silver Creek has enough delicate flowers. We could use an oak tree. Will that be all?" Beatrice, the woman flushed, paid for the work, and left without another word. About 2 weeks after her arrival, on a day when the cold had sharpened and the sky threatened more snow, the sound of heavy, familiar boots echoed on the porch. Ella looked up from the shirt gusset she was carefully setting, her needle poised in midair. Gabriel Blackwood filled the doorway. He seemed to bring the cold, clean air of the forest in with him. He removed his hat, revealing dark hair damp with melted snow. His gray eyes found hers across the small room. He gave a slight nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention to Martha, who had come to stand beside Ella. "Martha," he said, his voice that same low rumble. "Gabriel," she replied. "Heard you had a slip on the river drive. Thought you'd be laid up." "A section of the logjam broke free. Just a bruised leg, nothing to stop the work." He looked back at Ella, then at the meticulously repaired shirt in her hands. His gaze was assessing, practical. "The station master said you stayed on." "I did," Ella said simply. He didn't offer congratulations or condolences. He just took in the information. Then he gestured with his head toward the porch. "Brought you something." He went outside and returned a moment later, hauling a massive burlap sack that he dropped onto the rough-sawn floor with a heavy thud. The smell of sweat, pine sap, and damp wool filled the room. "My crew," he said, nudging the sack with his boot. "They're hard on their clothes, ripped seams, torn pockets, missing buttons. It's canvas, flannel, and wool. Hard work for a needle." He looked directly at Ella, his expression unreadable. "I pay 50 cents apiece for a shirt or trousers, $1 for a jacket, mended proper with reinforced stitches. No fancy work needed, just strength. Can you do it?" Ella's heart, which had been beating a slow, steady rhythm, began to pound against her ribs. She looked from his impassive face to the mountain of coarse, damaged fabric on the floor. It was a challenge. It was an offer. It was more work than she had seen in the last 2 weeks combined. It was a payroll. It was a purpose. She rose from her chair, the full height of her commanding the small space. She walked over to the sack, knelt down, and pulled out the first garment. It was a heavy wool jacket, its sleeve nearly torn off at the shoulder seam. She ran her fingers over the torn fabric, assessing the weave, the direction of the tear, the stress on the remaining threads. She saw not just the damage, but the solution, a blind stitch here, a bar tack to reinforce the pressure point there. She stood up, the heavy jacket in her hands, and met his gaze. "I can," she said. Her voice was clear and certain. It was not just a job. It was a commission, a contract. It was a man looking at her, seeing her skill instead of her size, and offering her a chance to build a life not as a wife, but as herself. It was a chance to stand firm, rooted by the strength of her own 2 hands, in the very place that had tried to cast her out. Gabriel Blackwood held her gaze for a long moment. Then he gave that same, small, definitive nod. "Good," he said. "I'll be back for them at the end of the week." He put on his hat and was gone, leaving the scent of the forest and the immense, tangible weight of her future lying in a heap on the floor. Ella looked at the sack, then at the jacket in her hand. She went back to her chair, threaded a new, thick linen strand, and plunged the needle into the waiting wool. The sound was crisp, sharp, and final. It was the sound of a root taking hold in new, hard ground. The sack of loggers' clothes became a weekly institution. Every Saturday, just as the afternoon light began to fade, Gabriel Blackwood's heavy boots would sound on the porch. He would drop a full sack of torn, sap-stained garments and pick up the one Ella had spent the week meticulously restoring. The exchange was the new rhythm of her life, a steady beat against the lingering discord of her arrival. Silver Creek still had its whispers, behind the counter at the Mercantile. William Prescott would watch her through the window, his expression a mixture of resentment and a strange, sour curiosity. To some, she was still Prescott's folly, a living, breathing monument to his poor judgment. They would watch her walk to the store for thread or beeswax, her posture erect, her gaze straight forward. They laughed behind their hands, but the laughter was becoming uncertain, losing its sharp edge. Something was shifting, slowly, like a river changing its course over stone. The change began not with minds, but with hands. A logger pulled on a flannel shirt Ella had mended and felt the new, sturdy seam at the elbow, stronger than the original. He ran his thumb over the double-stitched patch on his canvas trousers, a patch so neatly applied it felt like a part of the fabric itself. A woman borrowed a needle from her husband's mending kit, a needle Ella had sharpened, and marveled at how easily it slid through the heavy denim. The quality of her work began to speak for her in a language the town understood competence. It was a tangible thing. You could see it in the way a button was anchored with a small shank to prevent strain, in the way a darn was woven to mimic the pattern of the original cloth. Her skill was undeniable, and in a place where survival depended on things that were well-made and durable, an axe handle, a cabin wall, a winter coat that skill commanded a certain grudging respect. They began to look closer, past her height to the details. They saw the steadiness of her hands as she counted out coins for her purchases. They saw the focused set of her jaw as she examined a bolt of fabric. And they saw the way she walked. She did not scuttle or stoop. She moved with a straight-spined purpose, her long strides carrying her over the muddy ground with an unhurried grace that was its own form of defiance. She was not asking for their approval. She was simply living. And every Saturday, there was Gabriel. Their meetings were rituals of silence. He would arrive, bringing the clean scent of the pines with him, and stand in the doorway of her small workshop. He never crowded her, never entered the space uninvited. He would lean against the doorframe, a tall, quiet presence, while she finished her last few stitches on a garment. He rarely inspected the work. In the beginning, he had picked up a single piece, tested a seam between his thumb and forefinger, and given a single, satisfied nod. That had been enough. Now, he simply watched her hands. He watched the flash of the needle, the deft pull of the thread, the efficient, practiced way she folded the finished piece. His gray eyes, so steady and clear, held a quiet concentration. It wasn't the invasive stare of a man judging a woman, but the focused gaze of a craftsman observing another. He understood the language of her hands. Ella, in turn, was acutely aware of him. She never stopped her work, but the rhythm of it would change subtly. A new deliberateness would enter her movements, a heightened awareness of the task at hand. His silence was not empty, it was a comfortable, grounding weight. In his presence, she did not feel watched, she felt seen. Their conversations were sparse, brief exchanges about the practicalities that governed their lives. "The snow is getting deep in the high country," he might say, his gaze on the gray sky visible through the window. "The wind has a bite to it today," she would reply, not looking up from her work. "We'll need more of the heavy linen thread next week. I'll order it from the supply wagon on Tuesday." These were not the conversations of courtship. There were no pleasantries, no shared laughter, no attempts to charm or impress. But in the spaces between the words, something else was being built. It was a structure of mutual respect, assembled piece by practical piece. He brought her the problem of his men's torn clothing. She provided the solution. She needed a way to earn her keep. He provided the means. It was a partnership as clean and functional as a well-made dovetail joint. One week, he brought a pair of heavy leather work gloves. The palm of one was split wide open, the leather stiff and cracked. "Is there anything to be done for this?" he asked. Ella took the glove. It was huge, molded to the shape of his hand. She worked the stiff leather, her strong fingers testing its integrity. The scent of wood smoke, sweat, and worn leather rose from it. "The leather is too far gone," she said, her voice practical. "Any stitches I put in will just tear out when it gets wet again. But the design is sound. If you can bring me a good piece of hide, I can make you a new pair, using this one as the pattern." He looked from her face to the ruined glove in her hands. He saw no hesitation, no feminine uncertainty. He saw a professional assessment of a problem. He simply nodded. "I'll see to it." The following Saturday, along with a sack of clothes, he brought a supple, smoky-smelling piece of tanned deerskin. He didn't mention the gloves again. He didn't need to. He trusted her to do the work, and to do it well. The town, of course, was watching. Martha saw it all from her kitchen. She saw the way Ella's head would lift, almost imperceptibly, when the sound of his boots hit the porch. She saw the way Gabriel's gaze would linger on Ella for a moment before he turned to leave. A look that was neither soft nor hard, but something else entirely. A look of quiet recognition. Others saw it too. They saw Gabriel Blackwood, a man who kept to himself and his logging camp. A man who had no time for the town's gossip or its social gatherings, now making a weekly pilgrimage to the boarding house. His purpose was the very woman they had all dismissed. It was a confounding puzzle. They were not courting. Anyone could see that. There were no stolen glances across the church pews, no walks in the evening. There was just this quiet, weekly ritual at the edge of town. It made them reconsider. Perhaps they had been wrong. Perhaps a man like Gabriel Blackwood, a man who dealt in the solid realities of timber and stone, saw a different kind of value. Perhaps he saw in Ella Morgan's straight spine and capable hands a strength that had nothing to do with her size and everything to do with her substance. The laughter behind her back didn't stop completely, but it was quieter now, laced with confusion. They were no longer just looking at a tall woman. They were looking at the woman Gabriel Blackwood came to see. One Saturday, as a heavy snow began to fall, Gabriel prepared to leave. He slung the sack of mended clothes over his shoulder and pulled on his hat. He paused in the doorway, looking back not at Ella, but at the room, at the neat stacks of fabric, the organized spools of thread, the clean, purposeful space she had carved out for herself. "You've made a place here," he said, his voice low. Ella looked up, her needle still in her hand. Her eyes met his across the small room, through the swirling motes of dust in the fading light. "I was given the chance to," she replied. He held her gaze for a beat longer than usual. In that long, silent moment, the unspoken truth of her words hung in the air, asterisk. "You gave me the chance, asterisk." He gave a final nod and turned, disappearing into the curtain of falling snow. Ella remained at the window, watching his tall form recede. A dark, solitary figure moving toward the forest. He did not look back. She did not expect him to. They were not in love. But as the snow silently blanketed the town, anyone watching could see that something was being built between them. Something as quiet, as patient, and as strong as the ancient pines that bordered Silver Creek. Winter deepened its hold on Silver Creek, burying the muddy streets under a thick, silencing blanket of snow. The world grew smaller, quieter, confined to the warm circles of light cast by lanterns and hearths. It was in this season of inwardness that the church announced its annual winter social, a fundraising dance to repair the roof before the spring thaw. Martha brought it up over breakfast, pushing a notice across the table. "You should go," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You can't stay hidden in that sewing room forever. You're a part of this town now, whether they've all decided they like it or not." Ella's hands, which had been deftly buttering a piece of bread, stilled. The word dance conjured a familiar ghost, a phantom of past humiliations. She remembered the socials in Boston, the hopeful anticipation curdling into a long, lonely evening of standing by the wall. She was always the tallest girl in the room, a landmark of female awkwardness that young men nervously steered around. She would watch girls a head shorter than her twirl and laugh, and the feeling of being fundamentally, physically wrong would settle deep in her bones. "I'm not much of a dancer," she said, a polite, well-practiced excuse. "Nonsense," Martha countered, seeing straight through it. "You're a woman who knows how to stand up straight. That's more than half the battle. Besides, you need a reason to make yourself something fine for a change." The idea took root. Not the dancing, but the making. The thought of creating something for herself. A piece of armor forged not for utility, but for a quiet sort of beauty, was a challenge she could not resist. She would not go to the dance to seek approval or to find a partner. She would go as herself, on her own terms. She chose the fabric with care. It was not satin or lace, but a fine, soft wool in the deepest shade of forest green, the color of the pines at twilight. For 2 weeks, in the quiet hours after her paid work was done, she worked by the light of a single lamp. The project was an intimate conversation with her own form. She did not try to disguise her height or the breadth of her shoulders. Instead, she drafted a pattern that would celebrate it. The dress was a simple, elegant column, with long, fitted sleeves and a high neckline. Its only ornament was the perfection of its construction, the flat, immaculate seams, the precise set of the sleeves, the graceful drape of the skirt that fell straight to the floor. When it was finished, she looked at her reflection in the small, wavy mirror in her room and saw not a giantess, but a woman, complete and whole. The night of the social, the main room of the church hall was transformed. Pine boughs and holly decorated the rafters, and dozens of tallow candles cast a warm, flickering glow, smelling faintly of beeswax. A trio of local musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a harmonica played a cheerful reel. The air was thick with the scent of baked goods and the steam of mulled cider. When Ella entered, with Martha at her side, a hush fell over the room. The fiddle faltered mid-note. Conversations trailed off into silence. Every head turned. It was the train station all over again, but different. The stares were not of open mockery, but of stunned, reassessing silence. They saw a figure of undeniable grace and solemnity. The dark green dress made her seem not merely tall, but statuesque, a figure carved from the very forest that surrounded them. William Prescott, standing near the punch bowl, saw her and turned away abruptly, a splotchy red flush creeping up his neck. Ella kept her chin high, her heart a steady, defiant drum. She let her gaze sweep calmly over the room, meeting the eyes of those who stared, until they looked away. With Martha, she found a place on a bench against the far wall, folded her hands in her lap, and prepared to be an observer for the evening. She saw him almost immediately. Gabriel Blackwood was not a man for town socials. He stood near the entrance, a solid, solitary figure leaning against the wall, a world apart from the chattering townsfolk. He was wearing a clean flannel shirt and dark trousers, looking scrubbed and slightly uncomfortable, like a great bear lured out of the woods. He had seen her entrance. He had seen the room fall silent. Their eyes met for a fleet second across the crowded floor, a silent acknowledgement that passed between them. The fiddler, recovering his nerve, struck up a slow waltz. Couples began to pair off and move toward the center of the room. Ella watched them, a familiar, dull ache settling in her chest. It was just as she had expected. Then she saw Gabriel push himself off the wall. He began to move, not around the edge of the room, but straight through its center. The crowd parted for him. A low murmur rippled through the hall. Where was he going? He moved with the same unhurried purpose she had seen in the muddy street on her first day. He did not look left or right. His eyes were fixed on her. He stopped directly in front of the bench. He did not offer a bow or a flowery preamble. He simply extended his large, calloused hand to her. It was a clear, unambiguous invitation. Ella stared at his outstretched hand. For a moment, the world seemed to shrink to that single, silent gesture. He was not offering pity. His face was as serious and unadorned as ever. He was offering a choice. She could stay on the bench, safe in her isolation, or she could take his hand and walk into the center of the room, into the full glare of the town's attention. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and firm. He led her onto the floor. As he turned to face her, the whispers rose in pitch. Gabriel Blackwood and the tall woman. It was a sight no one had ever imagined. He placed his right hand gently, respectfully, on the small of her back. She rested her left hand on his broad shoulder. And then, it happened. A small, profound miracle. As they began to move to the music, she realized she was not stooping. Her spine was straight, her head was high. For the first time in her life, she was dancing with a partner whose stature matched her own. She could look straight ahead, not down at the top of a man's head. The lifelong, unconscious habit of making herself smaller simply fell away. She felt a lightness, a sense of rightness in her own bones that was so new and so powerful it almost took her breath away. They were not elegant dancers. They did not glide or twirl. Their movements were simple, solid, and sure. He led with a quiet confidence, and she followed with an easy, steady grace. They were two tall pines, swaying in a gentle wind, perfectly matched, moving as one. The rest of the room, with its gossip and its judgments, faded into a blur of candlelight and muted color. The waltz carried them in a slow circle around the floor. As they passed a row of candles flickering on a window ledge, their shadows grew long and danced on the wall beside them. In that moment of warm, passing light, Gabriel leaned in, his head slightly bowed. His breath was warm against the sensitive skin of her neck, and his voice was a low, resonant whisper, meant only for her. "You don't need to fit anyone," he said, his words a quiet truth in the cavern of her ear. "You are you." It was not a compliment. It was not a declaration. It was a validation, a release from a prison she hadn't even realized she was in. The words went straight to the core of her, extinguishing the last embers of her old shame. A warmth bloomed in her chest, powerful and pure. She didn't answer, couldn't answer. She simply inclined her head, a minute gesture of acceptance, and allowed herself to be led in the dance. When the music ended, they stopped in the center of the room. There was a moment of still silence. He escorted her back to her bench, gave a formal, almost imperceptible nod, and retreated to his post by the wall without another word. But the silence in the hall was different now. The whispers that started up again were of a different quality, no longer mocking, but filled with a stunned, recalibrating awe. Ella sat beside Martha, the warmth of Gabriel's hand still ghosting on her back, the echo of his voice a permanent resident in her ear. She was still on the sidelines of the room, but she was no longer on the sidelines of her own life. The storm did not arrive. It assaulted. It came from the north with the speed of a panicked herd, a wall of white that swallowed the mountains and then the town in a single, furious gulp. The wind, no longer a sighing presence in the pines, became a shrieking entity. It clawed at the roofs, rattled the window panes in their frames, and forced snow through every crack and crevice, dusting the interior sills with a fine, cold powder. Inside the boarding house, the world had shrunk to the warm, lamp-lit kitchen. The other boarders, their work in the mines and forests made impossible, were restless. They played cards with loud, forced cheerfulness, their voices rising to be heard over the gale. Martha moved with a heavy, deliberate calm, stoking the fire in the great iron stove, the scent of a long simmering stew filling the air. Ella sat in her small workshop, the door open to the kitchen's warmth. She was sewing, as she always did. But the work felt different today. The rhythm of her needle was the only steady thing in a world of chaotic sound. Stitch, pull, knot. It was a mantra against the storm's fury. She was mending one of Gabriel's flannel shirts, a deep blue one, where a pocket had been torn nearly clean off. Her movements were as precise as ever, but an unseen tension held her shoulders rigid. With every fresh gust of wind that battered the house, her fingers would pause for a fraction of a second. Her head would lift, her ears straining to listen past the noise, toward the north, toward the deep woods where blackwood timber lay. She imagined the colossal pines, groaning under the weight of the snow, their branches thrashing in the wind. She imagined the men in their bunkhouses, and Gabriel, moving among them, his presence a source of calm and strength. She knew he would not be idle. He would be out securing the equipment, checking on the animals, ensuring his men were safe. The thought was not a comfort. It was a worry, a sharp-edged stone in the pit of her stomach. She had not seen him that Saturday. The storm had descended on Friday night, cutting the camp off from the town. The empty space left by his missed visit was a palpable thing, an interruption in the quiet, steady rhythm they had established. The day bled into a long, dark evening. The wind rose to a maddening, incessant howl. The card game broke up, the men retreating to their rooms or staring moodily into the fire. Martha ladled out stew, and they ate in a subdued silence, the clink of spoons against bowls the only sound to counter the storm. Ella ate, but tasted nothing. Her focus was entirely on the roaring darkness outside the windows. It was close to 9 o'clock when the knock came. It was not a polite rap. It was a frantic, desperate pounding on the heavy oak door, a sound of knuckles against wood that was nearly lost in the wind, but held an urgency that cut through it. Everyone froze. A visitor, in a blizzard. At this hour, it meant trouble. Martha set down the dish she was wiping and moved to the door, her face set in grim lines. She slid the heavy bolt and cracked the door open. A blast of wind and snow surged into the room, sending papers flying and making the lanterns flicker wildly. A man stumbled inside, half falling into the room, bringing the full, frigid force of the storm with him. He was one of Gabriel's loggers, a young man named Silas, whose jacket Ella had mended just last week. He was encased in snow, his eyebrows and mustache frozen white. His face was pale with cold and shock, and he was breathing in ragged, painful gasps. "Silas, for God's sake, what is it?" Martha demanded, pushing the door shut against the storm. The young man leaned against the closed door, trying to catch his breath. His eyes, wide and frantic, scanned the room. He looked at Martha, then at the other men, and then his gaze landed on Ella. It held there. It's the boss," he gasped, his words coming out in puffs of white vapor. "It's Mr. Blackwood." Ella's hands, which had been resting on the table, went perfectly still. The needle she'd been holding was poised over the blue flannel. The world seemed to stop its roaring. All sound contracted to the young man's labored breathing. "There was a widowmaker," Silas went on, the words tumbling out now. "A big dead branch, heavy with snow. The wind brought it down. We were trying to clear a tree that fell across the main track to the bunkhouse. It came down so fast." He shook his head, his eyes haunted. "We got him out. We carried him back to his cabin. His leg, it's broken bad, and his head. He was unconscious for a time." No one in the room moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the howling of the wind, a mournful, terrible sound that seemed to be mourning with them. Ella did not cry out. She did not gasp. Her face, which had been placid, became a mask of absolute stillness. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin the color of fine porcelain. But her expression did not change. Her eyes, fixed on Silas, were clear and intensely focused. She was not hearing the story. She was absorbing the facts. Gabriel was hurt. He was in his cabin. He needed help. A wave of useless, panicked questions rose in the minds of the others. Asterisk, how bad is it? Did you send for the doctor? Can he be moved? Asterisk. But Ella did not ask them. She knew the doctor was 20 miles away in the next county. An impossible journey in this storm. She knew he could not be moved. The questions were a waste of breath. Action was the only thing that mattered. While Silas was still speaking, her decision was made. It was not a thought, but a physical imperative. A deep, silent shifting of her entire being toward a single purpose. She carefully placed her needle into the fabric of the blue shirt. Securing it, she set the garment on the table with a slow, deliberate motion. Then, she rose from her chair. Her movements were not hurried or jerky, but they were swift and economical. There was not a wasted gesture. She turned and walked to her small room at the back of the house, her long stride silent on the wooden floor. The others watched her go. A collective breath held in the room. She was gone for less than a minute. When she returned, she was transformed. She had pulled on her heaviest wool stockings and her sturdy, waterproof boots. She was shrugging into her thick gray wool coat, the one she had arrived in, her armor against the cold. In one hand, she carried a thick, hand-knitted wool scarf. She walked not to the table, but to the kitchen cabinet where Martha kept the medical supplies. She opened it and took out a roll of clean linen bandages and a small bottle of carbolic acid. She placed them in her deep coat pocket. Martha, who had been watching her with a profound, knowing stillness, moved to the stove. She wrapped a half-dozen freshly baked biscuits in a cloth and took a small, sealed tin of beef broth from the pantry. She pushed them into a canvas bag along with a lantern and a block of matches. She held it out to Ella. Their eyes met. Nothing needed to be said. Martha knew. Ella took the bag. She wrapped the thick scarf around her neck, pulling it up to cover her mouth and nose. She pulled on her gloves. She was ready. She turned to the stunned young logger. "I will go with you," she said. Her voice was low and calm, but it held a quality of unshakable resolve. It was not a request. It was a statement of fact. She was going. Silas stared at her, his mouth agape. "Ma'am, it's a blizzard. The trail has drifted over. You can't." "I can," Ella said, cutting him off. Her gaze was so direct, so certain, that his protest died in his throat. She walked to the door and waited, her hand on the latch. She was a tall, gray-clad figure of absolute determination, a pillar of strength in the flickering lamplight. She did not look back. She did not say goodbye. Her entire being was focused on the door, and on the dark, dangerous path that lay beyond it. The time for fear, for grief, for panic, might come later. Now was the time to walk. Silas, shamed and galvanized by her composure, straightened up and nodded. He pulled his own hat down tight. Martha opened the door. The wind tore at them, a physical blow. Ella leaned into it, her head bowed, her body a solid, unyielding force against the fury of the storm. She took the lantern from Martha's bag, struck a match against the doorframe, and in the third attempt, a small, brave flame flickered to life behind the glass. Then she stepped out, following the young logger into the white and roaring dark. The door of the boarding house closed behind her, shutting out the light. The walk to the camp was a battle against a living entity. The wind was a physical wall, and the snow a blinding, suffocating curtain. Silas led, breaking the trail, but it was Ella's own long-limbed stride and unyielding will that carried her forward. Every step was a testament, a silent vow. She did not feel the cold that seeped into her bones. Her entire being was a single, hot point of focus, aimed at the distant, flickering light of the logging camp. When they finally stumbled into the clearing, the loggers who met them were hollow-eyed with fear and helplessness. They were men accustomed to wrestling with the raw power of nature. But this, the fragility of their leader, the quiet enemy of injury, had rendered them useless. They parted for her as she approached Gabriel's cabin, their expressions a mixture of awe and desperation. The air inside was thick with the smells of wet wool, pine, and the faint, coppery scent of blood. Gabriel lay on his narrow cot, a stark, pale figure against the dark blankets. One leg was horribly twisted, bound in a crude splint of rough-sawn boards. A dark, ugly bruise was spreading from his temple into his hairline. His breathing was shallow. For a moment, seeing him so utterly still, so divested of his immense strength, a cold fist clenched around Ella's heart. But it was only a moment. The feeling was a luxury she could not afford. She set down the canvas bag, unbuttoned her snow-caked coat, and the competent, methodical seamstress took control. There was a tear in the fabric of this man's life, and she was here to mend it. "More light," she said, her voice cutting through the anxious silence. "And boil water. All you can." The men, grateful for a commander, scrambled to obey. In the improved light of 3 lanterns, she got to work. Her touch was gentle but firm as she examined the gash on his head, her fingers probing with a practiced sensitivity. She cleaned it with carbolic acid and linen, her stitches to close the wound as neat and precise as any she would put into a garment. The leg was worse. The break was severe. A clean snap of the tibia, but the splint was clumsy. Too tight in some places, too loose in others. With the help of Silas and another logger, she reset the splint, her calm instructions guiding their clumsy, powerful hands. That first night, she did not sleep. She sat in a straight-backed chair beside the cot, a sentinel in the quiet dark, listening to the rhythm of his breathing and the dying howl of the storm. And so the days began. They fell into a quiet, repeating pattern, a liturgy of healing. 18 days, each a bead on a rosary of devotion. Each morning, she would rise from the small bunk she'd been given in the main hall and walk the short, snow-packed path to his cabin. She would enter without knocking, carrying a bowl of warm broth or a cup of willow bark tea for the fever. Her first act was always to place the back of her hand against his forehead, a silent, clinical question. She would check the bandages, her movements efficient, her touch light. She would stoke the fire, sweep the floor, and open the door for a few minutes to let the sharp, clean winter air chase the scent of sickness from the room. In the long, quiet afternoons, she would sit in the chair by his bed and sew. She had brought the mending from the last sack of clothes, and the soft, rhythmic rasp of her needle passing through wool or canvas became the constant sound in the room. It was a sound of patience, of order being restored. It was the sound of her presence, more eloquent than any words of comfort could ever be, for Gabriel. Floating in and out of a haze of pain and laudanum, that quiet, repetitive sound became his anchor. It was the sound that meant he was not alone. It meant Ella was there. They did not speak much. In the first week, he was often delirious, murmuring names of his men, of trees, of the river. In those moments, she would speak to him, her voice low and calm, a soothing current beneath his fevered thoughts. "Rest now. Gabriel, you are safe." When the fever broke and his mind cleared, the silence between them was different. It was not empty, but full of a shared, unspoken understanding. He would watch her for hours, his gray eyes following the movement of her hands. He saw the strength in her long fingers, the absolute focus in her expression. He had seen her dignity in the face of the town's scorn. Now he was the sole recipient of her profound, unwavering strength. Affection grew between them like the slow, life-giving warmth of the winter sun. It was not a sudden fire, but a gradual thawing, a seep of heat into the frozen ground of their solitude. It was in the way she knew he needed a drink before he asked, the cup already at his lips. It was in the way he would save a fraction of his energy to thank her, his voice a rough whisper. It was in the way she mended a small tear in his favorite blanket, not because it was necessary, but because she knew he would appreciate it. These were the tiny, perfect stitches that were sewing their lives together. But while this quiet world of healing was being built in the isolation of the camp, another world, the world of Silver Creek, was churning with a different story. Once the storm passed, Silas had gone back to town for supplies. The news of Gabriel's accident spread like wildfire, but it was the second piece of news that truly set tongues wagging. Ella Morgan was at the camp. She had walked there in the blizzard. She had not returned. The story twisted as it traveled. The narrative of her courage was quickly overwritten by a tale of impropriety. Whispers started in the mercantile, as women gathered around the pot-bellied stove. "She's staying up there," Beatrice Miller said, her voice low and scandalized. "Alone, with all those men, it's hardly proper." "She's nursing him." Martha, who had come in for flour, snapped back. "Something none of you thought to do." "Nursing him or snaring him," another woman countered, and there was a murmur of agreement. "He's a bachelor with a profitable business. A woman of her stature must know her opportunities are limited." The whispers followed Ella in absentia. They painted her as an opportunist, a woman of loose morals using a man's injury to her own advantage. William Prescott heard the talk, and his lips thinned into a white, hard line. Her quiet dignity was, to him, a personal affront. And this latest news confirmed his initial judgment. She was not a respectable woman. Unaware and uncaring of the town's verdict, Ella's life remained focused on the small cabin. On the 18th day, she was changing the dressing on his leg. He was awake and clear-eyed, and had been for days. He watched her, his face stoic, though she knew the process was painful. She worked with a practiced gentleness, her hands clean and sure. As she finished tying the last bandage, she leaned forward slightly, her hand resting on the cot for balance. He moved his own hand, the one that wasn't bruised, and covered hers. His touch was not possessive or demanding. It was a simple, grounding contact, skin to skin. His hand was warm and rough with calluses. She froze, her gaze lifting to meet his. "Ella," he said, his voice stronger than it had been, a low rumble that was so familiar. She waited. He didn't thank her. He didn't compliment her. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding an intensity that spoke of long days of silent observation, of a conclusion reached in the quiet clarity of convalescence. "They told me what you did. He said that you walked here, in the storm." She gave a slight, dismissive shrug. "It was necessary." "Yes," he said, his thumb moving slightly over the back of her hand. "You do what is necessary." He paused, and his gaze deepened. "Don't leave." It wasn't a command. It was a request, stripped of all artifice, raw and direct. It was the first true thing he had asked of her. He was not asking for a nurse. He was asking for her. The quiet sound of the fire crackling in the stove filled the silence. Outside, the sun was shining on a world of brilliant, unforgiving snow. Inside, the warmth that had been slowly building between them finally settled, deep and certain. Ella looked down at his hand covering hers. Then she looked back at his face. She did not smile, but a softness entered her eyes. "I am not going anywhere," she said, and it was not a promise for the day, or for the week. It was a statement of fact, as solid and real as the ground beneath them. The news arrived on the back of a tired horse, carried by a man from town with a pouch of mail and a stack of printed notices. It was a formal announcement of a special town meeting, called by the mayor at the behest of the Union Pacific Railroad. A representative was coming to present a proposal for a new spur line, one that would connect Silver Creek directly to the main track, promising to bring in more goods, more people, and more money. Gabriel was sitting in a chair outside his cabin, his splinted leg propped up on a stool, the weak winter sun on his face. He read the notice once, his expression unreadable, and then read it again, a muscle tightening in his jaw. "They want to run the line through the North Ridge," he said, his voice flat. He didn't need to look at a map. He knew every ridge, every valley, every stand of timber as if it were an extension of his own body. Ella, who was hanging a blanket to air in the cold, paused. The North Ridge, but that's the old growth. The oldest, Gabriel confirmed, his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-covered peaks, 300-year-old pines, the headwaters for the creek, the straightest, easiest path for them. He folded the notice with a slow, deliberate precision, the paper creasing under the pressure of his thumb. His hands, she knew, were itching for the feel of an axe, for the solid work that was his life. Instead, he was bound to this chair. "The meeting is in 3 days," he said. "I'll need a wagon." Ella turned to face him, a protest already forming on her lips. "Gabriel, you can barely walk to the cookhouse. The ride into town will be agony. You're not strong enough." He lifted his gaze to meet hers. The quiet placidity of convalescence was gone, replaced by the hard, flinty resolve she had seen in him on her first day in Silver Creek. There are different kinds of strength. "Ella, if I let them cut the heart out of that forest without speaking a word against it, my leg healing won't matter much. A part of me will be broken for good." She saw the truth of it in his eyes. This was not about pride or stubbornness. It was about principle. The forest was not just a collection of trees to him. It was a trust, a living system he was a part of, not a master of. To remain silent would be a betrayal of his deepest self. Her protest died unspoken. He was right. This was necessary. The journey to town was slow and jarring. Gabriel sat on the buckboard of a supply wagon, his splinted legs stretched out awkwardly, his face pale and tight with pain. Ella sat beside him, a silent, supportive presence. Every bump and rut in the road sent a jolt through his body, and she could feel him bracing against it, his knuckles white where he gripped the seat. When they arrived at the town hall, the meeting was already underway. Their entrance caused a ripple of shock that spread through the crowded, stuffy room, the sight of Gabriel Blackwood, pale and leaning heavily on a rough-hewn crutch, silenced the speaker in mid-sentence, and beside him, her hand steadying his arm, was Ella Morgan. She was no longer a rumor, a subject of gossip. She was a fact, standing tall and resolute at his side. They found seats near the back. A man with a slick city suit and a confident smile was standing at the front of the room next to a large, unfurled map. This was Mr. Davies, the man from the railroad. He spoke of progress and prosperity, his voice smooth and persuasive. He pointed to the map, tracing the proposed route of the spur line, a bold red gash that cut straight through the heart of the North Ridge. "This line," he declared, his smile beaming, "is the future of Silver Creek. It means your goods get to market faster. It means supplies arrive in half the time. It means growth. It means jobs." He gestured to the green expanse on the map, "and all that stands in the way is a patch of old timber." William Prescott, sitting in the front row with the other town council members, nodded enthusiastically. "A necessary sacrifice for progress. Mr. Davies, we cannot let sentimentality stand in the way of profit." A murmur of agreement went through the room. The promise of money was a powerful anesthetic against the thought of what would be lost. When Davies had finished his presentation, the mayor, a portly man named Henderson, cleared his throat. "The council sees great merit in this proposal. Does anyone wish to speak on the matter before we move toward a vote?" A heavy silence settled over the room. Then, from the back, a voice, low and strained but clear, cut through the quiet. "I do." All heads turned. Gabriel was pushing himself to his feet, a slow, painful process. He leaned heavily on his crutch, his face beaded with sweat from the effort. Ella stood with him, her hand a steady, supportive pressure on his back. "Mr. Blackwood," the mayor said, surprised, "we heard you had an accident." "I did," Gabriel said, his voice gaining strength as he found his footing. "It reminds a man of what's fragile and what's not." He did not move to the front. He spoke from where he stood, his voice filling the room not with volume, but with a resonant gravity. I've spent my life in that forest. Mr. Davies, he began, his gray eyes locking on the railroad man. You call it a patch of old timber. I call it the town's heart. You see a straight line on a map. I see the gullies that carry the snowmelt down to the creek. The same creek where your wives draw water to wash your clothes and where your children fish in the summer. You see board feet and profit. I see a forest floor so thick with ancient needles that it holds the spring rains like a sponge, preventing the floods that used to wash out the lower valley every May. He paused, shifting his weight on the crutch. His gaze moved from Davies to the faces of his neighbors, the men and women he had known his whole life. I'm a logger. I cut down trees to live. I don't mistake a tree for a man. But I know the difference between a harvest and a slaughter. A harvest is taking what you need, with respect, leaving enough for the forest to heal, leaving something for those who come after. What you're proposing is a slaughter. You'll clear-cut that whole ridge, and when the money from that first cut is gone, you'll be left with a scarred, bleeding hillside that will pour mud into your creek every time it rains. You'll have traded a forest that has sustained this valley for centuries for a few years of profit. Prescott stood up, his face red with indignation. This is emotional nonsense. The railroad will bring more prosperity than that forest ever could. We can't be held back by one man's romantic notions about trees. It is not a notion. Gabriel's voice cracked like a whip, and a shocked silence fell. It is my life's work, just as your work, Mr. Prescott, is measuring value by what you can stack on a shelf. But some things cannot be measured in dollars. You can't put a price on clean water. You can't put a price on the land you leave your grandchildren. Davies, the railroad man, stepped forward, his smile condescending. Mr. Blackwood, your personal attachment is understandable, but this is a matter of business, of progress. Perhaps your recent confinement has made you overly sentimental. He glanced pointedly at Ella, a sly, insinuating look that the whole room understood. A hot, sharp anger rose in Ella's chest. They were not just dismissing his argument. They were trying to dismiss him, to use his injury and her presence to paint him as a weak, compromised man. Before she even knew she was going to move, she stepped forward, away from Gabriel's side. She stood in the aisle, tall and alone, drawing every eye in the room. My name is Ella Morgan, she began, her voice low but carrying to every corner of the hall. It did not waver. I am not a logger. I do not know the names of the trees on that ridge. I am a seamstress. I work with cloth and thread, but I know something about value. She looked at the faces staring at her, skeptical, curious, hostile. When some of you first saw me, you took my measure and decided my value. You saw a woman who was too tall, too plain, too much. You saw something that didn't fit, and you dismissed it. You looked at the surface, and you did not bother to look any deeper. Her gaze flickered for a second to William Prescott, who flinched as if struck. You are doing the same thing to that forest. You hear the word progress from a man in a fine suit, and you are ready to discard something you do not fully understand. You look at those trees and see only an obstacle, something to be cleared away to make room for what you think is better. She took a step forward, her voice rising with a quiet, passionate intensity. My trade teaches me that you do not make something strong by tearing out its foundation. You do not mend a garment by cutting away the strongest cloth. You reinforce it. You build upon it. That forest is your foundation. It is the strong cloth of this valley. And you are about to let a stranger come in with a pair of shears and cut the heart right out of it, promising to sell you a finer garment later. She stopped, letting her words settle in the profound silence. Look past the surface, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. Look at what is real, what is strong, what will endure. The choice is not between a forest and a railroad. It is between a lasting inheritance and a quick profit. It is between what has substance and what is merely a show. She turned and walked back to Gabriel's side, her movement a final punctuation mark. She had not raised her voice. She had not used grand, empty words. She had spoken from the core of her own experience, from the pain of being misjudged, and in doing so, she had held up a mirror to the entire town. The room was silent. No one looked at Mr. Davies or his map. They looked at Gabriel, leaning on his crutch, and at the tall woman standing by his side. They were no longer seeing an injured logger and his scandalous nurse. They were seeing two people of unshakable integrity. They were seeing the truth, standing right there in the back of the room. The vote was not taken that day. The town council, rattled by the unified front of Gabriel's experience and Ella's eloquence, deferred the vote on the railroad. It was a temporary victory, but a victory nonetheless. The journey back from the meeting was a quiet, exhausted affair. It was Martha who made the decision, her voice leaving no room for negotiation as she watched Gabriel being helped down from the wagon, his face gray with pain. "That's enough of that," she declared. "The camp is no place for a man to heal properly. The front room is empty. You'll stay here. Gabriel Blackwood, where I can keep an eye on you and Ella doesn't have to become a mountain goat to fetch you a cup of broth." And so, the logging camp's quiet invalid became the boarding house's resident patient. Gabriel moved into the ground floor room opposite Ella's workshop. The geography of their lives shifted from a distant, weekly intersection to a daily, domestic proximity. The walls of the boarding house became the boundary of their world, and within them, they created a new, shared rhythm. Their days fell into a pattern of quiet companionship. The mornings were for healing Ella, changing his dressings, Martha bringing trays of food, the slow, painful exercises Gabriel forced himself to do, his jaw set with determination. But the afternoons and evenings belonged to them. Gabriel would sit in a sturdy armchair in Ella's workshop, his splinted leg propped on a stool, and watch her work. The sharp, clean scent of pine that always clung to him now mingled with the familiar smells of thread and warm fabric. He learned the language of her craft through observation, the difference between a backstitch and a running stitch, the way she used a tailor's ham to press a curved seam, the incredible precision of her shears cutting through thick wool. Sometimes, she would ask for his help, and he would hold a heavy piece of canvas for her, his large, rough hands providing a steady anchor for her deft needlework. In these moments, they were partners in a task, a silent, cooperative dance of effort and skill. As the winter light faded early, Ella would put away her sewing, her eyes tired from the fine work. Then, one of them would read aloud. They made their way through a tattered copy of Shakespeare that a previous boarder had left behind, and a book of Psalms. Gabriel's low baritone would fill the room, the ancient poetry taking on a grounded, earthy quality in his voice. Ella would listen, her hands busy with a simpler task, polishing her needles with an emery cushion, or carding wool for a quilt she was planning. The sound of his voice became as constant and as comforting as the crackle of the fire in the hearth. They learned to play cribbage on a worn board Martha provided. The game became a conversation in itself. He was a patient player, thinking several moves ahead, his strategy as solid and straightforward as his character. She was quieter, more observant, learning to read the subtle tells in the set of his jaw or the way he held his cards. Their hands would brush as they moved the pegs on the board. Small, incidental contacts that sent a current of warmth through the cold air. They played for stakes of chores, who would fetch the next log for the fire, who had to help Martha peel the potatoes for supper. In the shared, simple laughter over a misplayed card, a new layer of ease and intimacy was being woven between them. The whispers in town had not died, but they seemed distant now, their power muted by the solid reality of life within the boarding house. Here, they were not a scandal. They were just Ella and Gabriel. Slowly, carefully, they began to share the pieces of their lives. He told her about the day his father taught him how to fell a tree, the respect and the fear of it. She told him about her mother's hands, how they were never still, how they could create beauty from a simple scrap of cloth. They were not grand confessions, but small, precious offerings, the quiet building of a bridge of trust between two solitary souls. One night, The snow began to fall again. It was not a violent blizzard this time, but a deep, silent, determined snowfall that muffled the world in a blanket of absolute peace. The other boarders had retired early. Martha was snoring softly in her room down the hall. Only Ella and Gabriel were left awake in the main room, the only light coming from the soft, hypnotic glow of the fire. He had pushed himself too hard that day, and the deep ache in his leg had returned. Ella had helped him back to his room, her shoulder supporting his weight. The air in the small room was cool, the fire in the small hearth having burned down to embers. "You're shivering," she said softly. She moved to the bed, her motions efficient and caring. She pulled up his blankets, her hands smoothing the worn wool with a familiar touch. She then went to the chest at the foot of the bed and took out a heavy patchwork quilt, the one she'd been working on. It wasn't quite finished, but it was warm. She spread the thick quilt over him, the colors vibrant in the dim light. She moved around the bed to tuck it in on the other side, her body leaning over his to reach. The warmth of the fire was at her back, and the cool sheets were beneath her hands. For a moment, she was very close. Her world narrowed to this single, intimate act of care, the scent of her of clean linen, soap, and something uniquely her own filled the small space between them. He had been watching her, his eyes dark in the firelight, as she leaned over. Her neck was inches from his face, a graceful, vulnerable curve. He did not move. He did not reach for her. He simply breathed, and then he spoke. His voice was a whisper, a current of warm air so soft it was more felt than heard against the skin of her neck. It was gentle, like the wind moving through the highest branches of a pine. "If that first night meant nothing," he murmured, his breath a ghost against her. She froze, her hands still clutching the edge of the quilt. The words dropped into the silent room, freighted with a meaning that was immense. Asterisk. That first night, asterisk. The night in the storm. The night the town had turned into a sordid rumor. He was acknowledging the shadow they had been living under, the story that others had written for them. He paused, letting the weight of the past hang in the air for a single heartbeat. Then he finished, his whisper a profound and tender promise. "Then tonight you'll know." It was not a proposition. It was a revelation. He was separating the past from the present, necessity from choice. Asterisk, that asterisk was for survival. Asterisk. This asterisk was for them. He was telling her that whatever the town thought, whatever they whispered, the truth of their story began now, in this quiet room, by choice, in perfect trust. Ella remained frozen for a long second, the world seeming to hold its breath. Then, slowly, she straightened up. She looked down at him. His face was turned up to hers, his expression open and completely vulnerable. There was no demand in his eyes, no expectation. There was only a quiet, waiting truth. She did not speak. No words were needed. She lifted a hand and gently, so gently, rested her palm against the rough stubble on his cheek. It was an answer, a confirmation, an acceptance, a silent, shared vow. She held his gaze for a long moment, the firelight dancing in their eyes. Then she finished tucking the quilt around him, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked to the single lamp on the bedside table and, with a soft puff of breath, extinguished the flame, plunging the room into the soft, intimate darkness, lit only by the dying, red embers of the fire. The morning after was not marked by grand declarations or awkward conversations. It was marked by the quiet, comfortable rhythm of a truth that no longer needed to be spoken. When Ella brought Gabriel his morning coffee, their eyes met over the rim of the steaming mug. In his gaze, she saw not the gratitude of a patient for his nurse, but the quiet, steady recognition of a partner. In her own, she no longer felt the need to guard her heart. The wall she had spent a lifetime building had, in the quiet of the night, simply dissolved. Weeks turned into a month. The deep snows of winter began to recede, giving way to the mud and promise of a reluctant spring. Gabriel's leg healed. the bone knitting with the slow, stubborn strength of a tree. He graduated from a crutch to a heavy wooden cane, his limp a testament to the ordeal he had survived. One bright, cold morning, he stood in the doorway of her workshop. "I need to go to the mercantile," he said, "for camp supplies. Walk with me." It was not a question. It was an invitation to a proclamation. They stepped out into the main street of Silver Creek. It was the same street Ella had walked on her first day, a gauntlet of mocking eyes and silent judgment. She had walked it then with a rigid, brittle dignity, her spirit braced against the world. Today, she walked it differently, with Gabriel's hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture as much for his balance as it was a quiet statement of possession. She felt not just tall, but boundless. Her stride was long and easy. She did not bow her head to anyone. The inner apology she had carried for a lifetime was gone, replaced by a deep, calm certainty. The town stopped to watch them. Heads turned in the saloon. Women paused on the boardwalks, their baskets on their arms. But the whispers were gone. The snickers had vanished. In their place was a look of grudging, then growing respect. They saw not a scandal, but a partnership. They saw the town's quietest, most resolute man, still marked by injury, choosing to lean, however lightly, on the strength of the woman they had all dismissed. They saw two people who fit together, not by the town's standards, but by their own. The air in Prescott's mercantile was thick with the smells of coffee beans, cured leather, and hypocrisy. William Prescott stood behind his counter, arranging a display of canned goods. When the bell above the door chimed and he saw them enter, his hands froze. Gabriel did not acknowledge him beyond a curt nod. He began to list his needs in a clear, business-like tone: sacks of flour, barrels of salt pork, new axe heads, a keg of nails. His voice was the voice of a man conducting a transaction, nothing more. Ella stood silently by his side. She let her gaze fall upon William Prescott, her expression not of anger or triumph, but of a simple, profound neutrality. She was looking at a man from a great distance, a figure from a past that no longer had the power to wound her. He was the one who could not meet her eyes. He busied himself with his ledger, his face flushed, a small man made smaller by his own small-mindedness. The true measure of the town's changing heart was not found in the silence of its gossips, but in the work that began to flow to Ella's door. It started slowly, then became a steady stream. Beatrice Miller, who had once spoken of Ella's limited opportunities, arrived one afternoon with a bolt of fine French silk. "My daughter is to be married," she said, her tone deferential. "I'm told you do the finest needlework in the county." The farmer, whose wife's christening gown she had altered, brought his own Sunday coat, asking if she could turn the collar to hide the wear. It was a task that required trust. Men brought her their torn work clothes, not in a sack delivered by Gabriel, but in their own hands, meeting her eyes and asking her price with a newfound respect. The town had finally learned to see her. They had looked past her height and seen the substance of her character, and they were answering her. Not with apologies, but in the most honest language. They knew the language of work, of trust, of undeniable skill. She and Gabriel did not marry. There were no promises of forever, no talk of rings or vows. Their life together was not a destination they had arrived at, but a path they were walking, day by deliberate day. Their future was an unspoken thing, a quiet understanding that was as solid and real as the ground beneath their feet. They fell back into their evening routines, the reading, the cribbage, the comfortable silences, but now, an easy intimacy infused every moment. A casual touch as they passed in the hall, a shared look across the dinner table that said more than words ever could. They had no need to explain themselves or define what they were. They simply were, together. One evening, as the last of the winter snows began to fall, they stood by the window in her workshop. The lamp was turned down low, and the room was filled with the soft glow of the fire. Outside, the great silent flakes drifted down. blanketing the town in a fresh layer of white, offering a clean slate. Gabriel stood behind her, his chest a warm, solid presence against her back. His hands rested on her shoulders, and his chin was near her temple. They watched the snow fall, their breaths fogging the cold glass. They had come so far from that first day of brutal rejection, from the terror of the storm. They had built something strong and true in the heart of a place that had not wanted them. She felt the low rumble in his chest before she heard the words. A quiet question. "What are you thinking?" Ella leaned her head back against his shoulder. A small, trusting movement. She thought of her arrival, of the shame and loneliness that had been her only companions. She thought of the dance, of his words whispered in the candlelight. She thought of the long, healing days in the cabin, and the quiet, certain dawn that had followed the night he had given her a new beginning. She turned her head, her lips close to his ear. She whispered her reply, an echo, an answer, a perfect and complete circle. I know the meaning now. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love to hear your thoughts, and if you feel like sharing, let us know in the comments where you're listening from so we can all connect. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. And to help this story reach more listeners, please press that hype button to show your support. We appreciate every single one of you.